Thank you very much, Walter, for your wonderful introduction, and thank you all of you for attending this talk. I'm really looking forward to our conversation at the end. And I would like to thank Humanities Center more generally for providing this type of opportunity to really present interdisciplinary research and engage in conversations with scholars from different departments. I think for people like myself who do research at the intersection of several subjects, it's really, really valuable to have people from different departments be able to engage in a conversation about this type of research. The paper that I'm presenting today, it's actually a revise and resubmit paper submitted to American Review of Public Administration. So if you have any comments, suggestions with regard to enforcing my revisions, I would appreciate it very much, either in public or in private. And this piece of research actually is based on my previously collected data. So it doesn't have any institutions and organizations from Detroit metropolitan area yet, but some of its findings are definitely very relevant for cultural institutions in Detroit metropolitan area, and I would be making reference to these institutions as I go. So first of all, the kind of general theme or the general body of literature that I'm contributing to with this research is the literature on sustainability. Sustainability by now has become a kind of word that's so widely used across different disciplines that it's very difficult to even imagine any single discipline that wouldn't be seeking to explore the studies of sustainability. And yet, we don't really have a precise definition of what sustainability is. Rather, we have multitude of different definitions. It seems to be that one of the most acceptable definitions of sustainability is the definition of sustainable development offered by the World Commission of Economic Development. Essentially, sustainable development is defined as development that meets the needs of future generations without compromising the needs of current generations, and vice versa. Sustainability also across different disciplines is looked upon as a multi-dimensional concept, and there seems to be a general understanding that sustainability has at least three pieces: social sustainability, environmental sustainability, and economic sustainability. That's the most accepted model. What I argue, and some other scholars, is that essentially we're missing a cultural dimension of sustainability that's no less important than all of these other three dimensions. And I'm hoping that my work in the long run will contribute to adding culture as the fourth dimension of sustainability. Some of the famous scholars who already kind of suggested a way to add culture to sustainability include the work of David Crosby. David Crosby is a cultural economist, and he essentially argues that economic and cultural systems should be taken together as part of the unified sustainability framework. And in this regard, cultural institutions and organizations, including the arts, are very important contributors to sustainability. So that's the kind of work that I'm building on in this paper. So culture. Culture is a very amorphous term, and I'm sure there are so many definitions of culture that we wouldn't be able to even go through them in the course of one presentation. But generally speaking, the two main approaches is either defining culture narrowly as cultural institutions and organizations, including the arts, or defining culture broader as shared meaning and patterns of behavior and values shared within a certain society. So for the sake of this paper, I'm adopting a narrow definition of culture, and I'm looking at sustainability of public and non-profit arts organizations as a form, institutional form of cultural sustainability. But there is also a relationship between organizations, cultural organizations, and broader definition of culture, because cultural organizations actually contribute to values, beliefs, and shared meaning. So there is implications from institutionalized culture to society as a whole. I also define sustainability at the organizational level as essentially a two-layered concept. The first layer of sustainability is survival, institutional survival. I say that institutional survival is a baseline for sustainability. And actually, most of the studies on sustainability of cultural institutions precisely focus on this first dimension, institutional survival. And majority of scholars come to a conclusion that healthy finances, diversity of revenue sources, and the healthy balance between expenditures and revenues is something that really defines survival of cultural institutions. I accept survival as an important piece of sustainability, but I try to take it a little bit further in this paper, because if we talk about public and non-profit organizations that serve a certain public purpose, that we can not only think about them from this survival point of view, because they are not business firms, they are not private organizations. So when we talk about public institutions, we have to define sustainability as first, survival, but second, intergenerational sustainability. So the ability of institutions to persist across generations and fulfill their mission. So that's the type of sustainability that I'm using in this paper, and this paper is mainly about the second level of sustainability, or better to say the relationship between two. So what is my research question? What am I interested in here? Mostly I am interested in defining what exactly intergenerational sustainability is at the organizational level. So my unit of analysis is organizations. And I am doing this by looking at various sustainability strategies developed within the world of public and non-profit arts organizations, and I explore what exactly it takes for an organization to become intergenerationally sustainable. So in other words, what types of strategies help organizations to transition from survival to intergenerational sustainability? There are two sets of literature that I am using to inform this research question and my research approaches. The literature on ethical sustainability and the literature on strategic management. So the studies of intergenerational sustainability from an ethical point of view are few, but nevertheless they provide some ideas of how we can understand intergenerational sustainability as a normative idea. Some scholars conceptualize intergenerational sustainability as a form of equity or fairness among generations, and they also define intergenerational sustainability as the ability of institutions to ensure equality of opportunity between generations, or in some cases, like Derek Parfit defines it, treating future generations as a priority and personalizing decisions as if we were making decisions for our own children. So this offers us some idea of how we can think about sustainability as an ethic, but it doesn't really give us a straightforward framework that we can put onto the study of sustainability in organizations. The other piece of theory that I'm using is the strategic management paradigm. Strategic management was actually transposed to public sector organizations from a private sector. And it was done as part of the new public management in late 80s and early 90s. And the idea was essentially that public sector organizations were criticized for being inefficient, ineffective, and slow. So what was the solution? The solution was to export some of the tools from private sector to really enhance the ability of public organizations to be effective and efficient. The elements of this paradigm include helping organizations with their decision-making process, so improving decision-making, helping organizations to be more competitive and essentially enhance their effectiveness. And this type of paradigm also considers the needs of stakeholders. So stakeholder is key in the strategic management paradigm. So what I say that essentially this strategic management paradigm is really, really helpful for public and non-profit institutions to ensure their survival. It allows them to be competitive and it allows them to survive. So it kind of gives us the first baseline of sustainability, but this strategic management paradigm doesn't really consider intergenerational terms. And in general, if we look at an average strategic plan will be developed on average for 3 to 5 years, and some organizations go as far as 10 years or maybe 20 years. But in either case, they don't go with this paradigm intergenerationally. So considering these drawbacks in the existing literature, I essentially adopt the grounded theory for this approach. In its classic sense, the grounded theory, the way it was developed by Glaser, Strauss, and Corbin, is used to develop a straightforward, coherent framework where this theory doesn't exist. But there are also newer versions of the grounded theory, and more recently, grounded theory was also used to develop greater insights about a specific phenomenon of interest. Grounded theory was also used to refine and extend existing theories. So I'm going with this later interpretation of grounded theory as something that allows us to define concepts and to develop frameworks rather than a straightforward, coherent theory. The major method of data collection includes semi-structured interviews with top and middle level managers at cultural organizations. And I have actually included 3 types of cultural institutions in this study: museums, literature, music, and performing arts. But in this paper, I really use the case of museums to illustrate my findings because it kind of provides us an opportunity to look a little bit deeper rather than just reporting some generalized findings. My cutoff point for the choice of organizations was 35 years old. 35 years is an average distance among generations. And although it's an assumption, I sort of argue that organizations that have been in existence for at least 35 years, they would have been able to serve multiple generations. And although there are exceptions, and we have the examples of institutions that were in existence for 200 years that still disappear, so that happens as well. But for the sake of choosing organizations as examples of sustainable organizations, I use this 35-year threshold. I was also able to choose organizations with different institutional structures to explore the structural argument and whether structure matters for sustainability. I was able to include freestanding non-profit organizations as well as university-affiliated museums. So why museums? Well, for one, the logic and ethic of sustainability is actually embedded in museums' mission. Museums were created in the first place to collect, preserve, and sustain cultural capital across generations. So to that extent, museum sustainability is part of museums' mission. But even if we look at contemporary museums and what exactly museums do, we can truly consider museums public institutions, even though some museums are private. And we can kind of like look at what museums do. Museums are some of the most mainstream cultural organizations. They exist in different shapes and sizes, and they serve different kinds of communities. And what's fascinating that museums don't only offer access to cultural capital and cultural heritage, but they also provide opportunities for people to engage, for instance, in community service by being a museum volunteer. And it's fascinating that 1 in 480 Americans over 18 years old is a museum volunteer. So museums have this ethic of sustainability embedded in them from the moment of their creation. But they actually demonstrate that they are important social institutions, and they engage in all kinds of strategies to demonstrate this significance. If we look at the museum's history, and especially if we look at some of the recent consequences of recession, we will find that not every museum was able to sustain the consequences of the recession. And here I have the examples of museums that ceased to exist. Some of them were able to go back a little bit to some sort of operation. For instance, Minnesota Museum of American Art was able to open to public for limited hours, but most of its collections is still in storage. So these are kind of the negative examples of sustainability, where sustainability didn't work. There are also other alternative responses to recession within museum community. These types of responses essentially allow museums to survive. Some of the most typical responses include deaccessioning or selling some of the artworks, or using long-term leases of artworks to private galleries. And here I have examples of museums that engaged in this type of tactic in order to survive. The other common response will be merging several collections in one entity, and while this type of solution works out well when missions of museums are similar, it might not work out all that well when missions are different, because essentially a more powerful institution would subsume, in this case, the mission of a smaller institution. So the smaller institution and its purpose will be lost. So we can hardly consider this sustainable. And the last one is the response that comes from outside of the museum world. It's the way we try to use museums and collections inside of the museums to solve other social and economic problems. And the case of the Detroit Institute of the Arts is a great example of how this exactly happens. So essentially, there is a certain instrumentalizing of the cultural institutions that happens and that contradicts to this idea of sustainability. And at the beginning, I was defining sustainability as a three-level concept. So in case of DIA, what we have essentially an effort to use cultural sustainability, cultural institution for the sake of solving economic problems or social problems. So these other dimensions of sustainability go in conflict with cultural sustainability. Are such responses sustainable? Well, they might ensure the short-term survival, and the institution might still be here, but it might not necessarily be sustainable. So what do I find? By looking at examples of sustainable institutions, I essentially find that the long-term sustainability of museums results from the dynamic interrelationship and combination of these two narratives. And I actually have given you two handouts, and In one of these handouts, there is a table that kind of summarizes both of these narratives. But I will be discussing these narratives now. And for the rest of this paper, I will be discussing the narratives, I will be discussing the relationship among these narratives, and I will be discussing the role of museum managers in reconciling potential contradictions among these narratives. So the first narrative is institutional resilience narrative. Institutional resilience is more prevalent, it's more explicit, and it's possible to find evidence of this narrative in museum missions, strategic plans, and formal documents, as well as by interviewing managers. But the second narrative, it's no less important, but it's much less explicit. It's a distinctiveness narrative. It's less prevalent, it's more implicit, and we can find the traces of this narrative in institutional routines, as well as in analyzing the decision-making discourse by museum managers. So what is institutional resilience narrative? First, I found a special kind of institutional rationality that leads to the increased capacity over time, the capacity of institutions to cope with unanticipated dangers. This resilience narrative is very much similar to the resilience narrative found in other studies, especially, for instance, in the studies of environmental resilience or public safety. And the way it was described by managers that I interview includes such words as adaptability, flexibility, change, innovation, turning challenges into opportunities, and capitalizing on the failure. So what it means that for the museum institutions to survive and sustain in the long run, they have to be resilient. And while the studies of resilience are very prevalent in environmental sciences, they are only now emerging in the arts and culture. The resilience narrative essentially results from the combination of two elements. The first one is structural adaptability, and the second one is increasing social and community relevance. Because I was able to look at different types of institutions, freestanding and university affiliated, I was essentially able to ask managers to compare the advantages and disadvantages of each of these institutional structures with regard to survival and sustainability. And I was also able to ask them to reflect on what type of institution do they think is going to be more sustainable in the long run. So that's the second handout that you have. It essentially has a comparison between these two institutional forms, including the comparison of the potential of mission drift, because mission drift could happen in each of these institutional structures, but for different reasons. So essentially what I find that institutions that are more likely to survive and sustain, the structure itself doesn't matter, but what matters is the ability of institutions to capitalize on the strengths of each of these institutional structures. I also find the evidence of certain institutional hybridity and the transposition of sustainability strategies from one type of institution to another. So, for instance, freestanding non-profit museums try to be more sophisticated and try to be more academic, if I can use this word, to build up new audiences. On the other hand, university museums try to be more open to the public, because there is this superstition that university museums are closed entities and members of the general public don't really want to engage all that much with them. So there is this transposition of institutional strategies, and that's how structural adaptability works. The second part of this resilience narrative is specific strategies that museums engage in order to increase their social and community relevance. And this social and community relevance is as important as fiscal sustainability that was largely acknowledged in previous literature. So I find these four types of strategies that fall under the social and community relevance. Engaging in public and private partnerships, implementing interdisciplinary projects, utilizing technology and social media, and diversifying and expanding community outreach. And what I find that museums engage in audience as early as 3 years old, because they understand that the earlier they reach young generations, the more likely that young generations will actually form a sustained commitment to a specific museum institution and to culture and arts in general. What's also interesting about the social and community relevance, when I was analyzing all of my data, I had this idea in mind that it almost sounds like museums are learning a new language to talk to younger generations. So for instance, if you look at technology and social media, younger generations are all about technology and social media. And if museums want to survive and sustain in the long run, they essentially have to learn this new language, the language of technology and the language of social media. There is no way around that. So that's the kind of learning that happens at the institutional level. I also was able to kind of explore this resilience narrative from an ethical point of view. And if you look at all of the strategies and kind of examples of specific things that happen in the museum world, essentially what happens is sustainable museum functions as a socially responsible institution committed to public values, regardless of whether it's a non-profit museum or if it's a public or a municipal museum. What's important is for sustainable institutions to function as socially responsible organizations committed to these three sets of values: accessibility, social equity, and transparency. Examples of kind of replication of these values at the level of management strategies include equity of the outreach. And one great example is offering need-based scholarships for art classes. In part, it's driven by donors. In part, it's driven by public funding. But there is also an understanding within museum community that this is important for the mission of the museums. We also have examples of museums digitizing their collections. And it's amazing that such major museums as Metropolitan Museum of Art or Getty were able to digitize and completely put into a public domain some of the best works of art. That would, if you think about it in intergenerational terms, that would have been unthinkable 50 or 100 years ago. The other example of museums becoming more public, so raising the degree of their publicness, is opening some of the sacred pieces of museum practice to public. One such example is the London Conservation Center at the American Art Museum. It's the first art conservation facility that allows behind-the-scenes views of the preservation work to be public. So something that was always closed now is becoming public. And it's driven by this need of transparency and commitment to wider public outreach. So the second narrative, and it's also outlined in this table that I gave you, it's institutional distinctiveness narrative. Institutional distinctiveness narrative is less explicit, but it's no less important for the long-term sustainability of museums. The basic element of this narrative is the ability of museums to stay true to their core mission. That doesn't mean that mission doesn't evolve, but it means the ability of museums to stay true to themselves. And here I have a quote by one of the museum managers who essentially reflects on the fact that everything is going to change in 100 years from now. The decisions are going to be different, the external circumstances are going to be different, everything. But what's going to stay, and something that museums can depend on, is the proximity to the mission that you enact every moment. So the mission has this ability to serve as a goalpost for sustainable museums. Other elements of this narrative include occupying unique institutional niche, and we can go as extreme as a Motown Museum, for instance, the only museum in the world with that type of mission. So that would be an extreme example of this institutional distinctiveness, but there are other museums. And museums, each of them in their own way, try to build up this ability to occupy a unique niche. The other important elements of this narrative include promoting and cultivating socially important values, shifting towards a semi-instrumental role. So when we think about how we think about the purpose of the arts and culture for society, we either tend to think about it instrumentally, well, arts and culture as another sector of the industry that provides jobs and employment opportunities. So that's an instrumental view. There is also an intrinsic view. We should appreciate arts and culture as a value in itself. But what I find that museums that aspire to have intergenerational sustainability, they kind of fall in between these two roles, and they essentially function semi-instrumentally, which means that museums contribute to society on the level of values that are important for this society, such as responsibility, stewardship, and critical thinking. Museums also contribute to social discourse in multiple ways, and we have examples of museums engaging in environmental sustainability exhibitions or in social diversity types of exhibitions. So museums go outside of their main cultural mission to a degree that's permitted by this distinctiveness narrative. And finally, a major part of museums' distinctiveness is their ability to capitalize on the unique museum learning that's based on emotional experience and building connections with the audience. Specifically, the role of museum objects, the institutionalized and objectified form of cultural capital, is very important. And it's actually important not only for art museums, it's important for natural history museums. And I find a lot of evidence of museum managers being very committed to the objects. But the role of objects has changed very much from just being the impersonations of cultural capital to being kind of an opportunity to set up a discourse and discussion. So it's not the objects themselves that matter, but how objects are used to spike conversation and debate. So, like I said, these narratives work together to help public and non-profit arts organizations to transition from survival to sustainability. But I also find that certain contradictions between these two narratives. As an example, sometimes effective short-term solutions that enhance institutional survival might not be sustainable. So there is a literature that discusses the problem of commercialization of the arts sector. Or, for instance, from a public management point of view, this idea of using performance standards for arts organizations and using ticket sales as performance standards, or looking at curatorial work as a marketing. So these types of strategies, they're really helpful and they really ensure museums' survival, but in the long run, they might have negative implications for the distinctiveness narrative. The other example is this idea that strategic growth doesn't always mean sustainability. For instance, one of the popular strategies among museum community, and that's actually a strategy that Detroit Institute of the Arts has been engaged in for a while, is to use donations from powerful patrons to invest in high quality collections and to really gain national and international prominence. While underinvesting into endowment, that's exactly what happened with DIA, because DIA was able to get a national and international acclaim, but the size and kind of the funding that was going into its endowment was very different and much smaller as compared, for instance, to the Chicago Institute of the Arts or Cleveland Art Museum, so museums in comparable cities. So we have a certain survival type of strategy here, but we have a lack of sustainability. And the other example that I have already briefly mentioned is this idea of instrumentalizing the arts, so including arts into projects just because we need to be interdisciplinary, rather than truly valuing what arts and cultural institutions can add to sustainability. So here it's important to treat art as an equal partner to enforce this narrative. So these contradictions have to be reconciled, and what I find that the key pieces of reconciliation is actually this idea of sustainable thinking implemented and exercised by museum managers. Sustainable thinking is all about balancing institutional values and missions with specific resilience strategies. And it manifests itself in incremental, day-to-day decision-making rather than in drastic changes and complete reinvention of institutions. And sustainable thinking is actually different from strategic management. It's different from the strategic management paradigm that I discussed at the beginning of this talk. And finally, strategic management also has an ethic imperative, and it has an imperative of museums being committed to future generations. So let me explain this a little bit more by using actually some quotes from the interviews. So here on the right, is it right? Yeah, here on the right, I have a quote of a museum manager that talks about this idea of strategic thinking. And here I have a quote that talks about the sustainable thinking. So for instance, the first quote essentially discusses the limitations of strategic plans as formal documents that don't really seem to 100% work in real life. And what's important is that take advantage of the opportunities rather than just blindly following the strategic plan. So that's an example of strategic thinking. We have a plan as a framework, but we take advantage of opportunities as we go. So we keep our eyes on the prize or on the result. This other quote is more about the evidence of sustainable thinking that I'm finding that helps to reconcile differences among narratives. And here the language is more about the values and how the values that museums contribute to society in the long run lead to museums' own self-sustainability. So the language is the sense of responsibility, developing more responsible citizens, and in the long run, it will increase the chances of museums having a longer life. So it's similar in some ways, but there is also a distinction. And here I have the distinctions kind of summarized between these two types of thinking, strategic thinking and sustainable thinking. So what I essentially find, I don't find like an either-or type of relationship between strategic thinking and sustainable thinking. I find that those two types of thinking should go together. because it's impossible for any institution to survive if they're not being strategic. So strategic thinking is important, but on the other hand, to be truly sustainable in the long run, it's also important that museum institutions and other institutions of similar way exercise sustainable thinking on the top of the strategic thinking. So sustainable thinking is the extension of strategic thinking. So strategic thinking is all about improving decision making in organizations and improving strategic positioning of a specific organization or institution in a society. It's all about using external and internal quantifiable information to achieve certain results. So it's very much result oriented. And on the other hand, sustainable thinking is less guided by the results logic. It's more guided by the values logic, and it's much more intuitive. And it's all about preserving and fostering long-term institutional legacy. In terms of, if we kind of try to put this in a question form, sustainable thinking would be asking, what is the mission and what is the goal of my organization? What do I do? How do I use external and internal information to really achieve this goal? And how do I gain a competitive advantage? So that would be the type of strategic thinking. How do I maximize my outputs? Sustainable thinking will be more about what is important for my organization in the long run. What type of legacy would I like to leave? What sorts of values are important for all of my strategies and actions. So that's the kind of difference. And this type of difference actually makes sense to us when we look at people, because you could conceivably see a person who is being very strategic and very effective and attaining their goals very well, but will all of their strategies be sustainable? Along the lines of them achieving their personal goals, they might lose something important. They might lose relationships, they might lose friends. So that's how it plays out essentially at the institutional level as well. And finally, what I find is that commitment to future generations really helps to guide sustainable decisions and sustainable thinking. And although most of this commitment is implicit in specific institutional routines, I also found an evidence of museum managers actually talking about future generations when they discuss specific decisions. In fact, the language that they use is very similar to some of the ethics theories that suggested personalizing decision making when we think about intergenerational sustainability. So these two quotes come from different institutions, but we have similar language: your children, your grandchildren, their children. So essentially, while talking about their institution, managers of these two organizations personalize decision making as if they were making decisions for their own children. So what is research kind of resulted so far in? First, it allows us to look at sustainability as a multidimensional concept and hopefully add culture as the fourth dimension of sustainability. It also allows us to look at sustainability in organizations that goes beyond survival. So survival is the first level, and sustainability in the long run is the second level. This paper also was able to identify two interrelated narratives of intergenerational sustainability that have a very dynamic relationship. They together work to enhance institutional sustainability, but at times they contradict with each other. And it becomes the task of museum managers through sustainable thinking to essentially reconcile contradictions among these narratives. So what it means for us, it means that sustainability in organizations is not an endpoint. It's a process and it's an ethic that we can explore through organizational routines and managerial decisions. So as a wrap up to this paper, I would like to thank my political science colleagues who provided comments on the earlier version of this paper. And I would also like to tell you that I'm currently engaged in the research on survival and sustainability of urban cultural organizations in Detroit metropolitan area. So I'm taking this research into a new context, and I'm looking at the relationships among institutions. And this research is supported by Wayne State Humanities Center, and essentially my basic question is to explore relationship between social connectedness of public and non-profit cultural organizations and the level of their sustainability, survival as well as sustainability. And at the end of this talk, I would also like to announce a sustainability scholars group that myself and several other colleagues are putting together. And the idea behind this group is to bring together people who work on sustainability agenda across all of these different pieces So we could set up a discourse and we could actually share some of the ideas of how we define sustainability, what it means to us, and hopefully maybe we can collaborate on certain projects, including projects with very specific strategic outcomes, such as searching for external funding. So if you're interested in participating in this group, please feel free to contact Rahul Mitra, he's here from Communications Department, or myself. Thank you, and at the end I'll put out some photos from support, from the march in support of Detroit Institute of the Arts that I have attended last year. And that was fascinating to me because there is a lot of appeal to future generations and the importance of culture to future generations.
Dr. Moldavanova has left quite a lot of time for questions and responses. So there you are.
Yeah.
This is a question or comment that I've directed to you before about this project, and it might be helpful to have the combined brain power of like the audience to think about it, and perhaps you could address it if this isn't clear from the talk. Mike, I have a concern about the project based on the possibility that you are sampling a dependent variable. And what I mean by that is your universe of cases, I think, are instances where institutions or museums have survived. And it seems to me that in order to make a strong claim about what museums need to do, you need to look at the Bead Museum or whatever, and show that they were not doing the things that you're talking about, and that the museums that survive do the things you're talking about.
So in follow-up of your suggestion and other people's suggestions, right, the idea was to explore this type of different levels of sustainability in a local context. So actually my current project that I'm working on in Detroit metropolitan area would look at institutions with different degrees of sustainability. And not necessarily institutions that completely ceased to survive, but institutions that had some serious troubles, or institutions that we wouldn't necessarily call sustainable. So what I'm trying to do, instead of following up on some of these other organizations in other areas, I decided to explore variation and sustainability levels here in Detroit metropolitan area. So that's the idea, to have institutions of three groups: sustainable institutions in the middle and not very sustainable institutions, and to see how these narratives and some of the strategies play out and what makes a difference. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. First of all, thanks for presenting this research. I think it's really fascinating. I love the idea that you're talking about this, the competing narratives, but I tend to sort of view it more as a creative tension almost between these two narratives. And so what I'd love to see sort of more of, and maybe you could talk more about this, is how you're seeing this creative tension sort of almost operate as a dialectic, both within the organizations that seem to be working. We never know, right? I mean, they could go, some of them could go bankrupt and close maybe 5 to 10 years down the line, and then we'd say, well, okay, this didn't quite work. So it's almost like a push and pull, a tension really between these two forces. The other thing, which I think would be really interesting to look at, is not just think about these museums as institutions in their own sort of bubble, but really how are they operating in the broader institutional social environment. And I know you talked about networks, institutional networks in your present project, but maybe taking a more institutional perspective to really thinking about what are the discourses really that these institutions operate, whereby, how do they sort of change? How do they enable as well as constrain these institutions to change as well? I think the discourse of children was really interesting, both from the perspective, yes, for future generations, but it also smacks a little bit of paternalism in my view. So I think really unpacking the tensions involved would be a great way.
And you are absolutely right. I mean, there is a dialectic relationship between these two narratives, and I'm kind of still in search of explaining and choosing the right language to explain the relationship between the two. Because on one hand, we have a dialectic, but on the other hand, both of these narratives have to really work together to help institutions to transcend from survival into sustainability. So I'm kind of explaining it in multiple ways for this reason. But you know, there was one paper that I recently read that essentially talks about how public organizations are so complex that you would find multiple theories at play at the same time within one institution. So that's what I'm finding here as well, this kind of complex rationality that draws on different pieces. And in terms of your second suggestion, exploring the broader environment, what I think you mean is probably like political environment, right, and economic environment, and the demographic composition of the audience that museums serve. So that's in part is one of the purposes of the research that I'm doing here in Detroit metropolitan area, because for this paper I have used organizations that are located in 6 different states. So obviously the environment was very different, and I had to make an assumption that I'm going to put environment aside. But here, when I actually explore connectedness, and I define connectedness as 2 types of relationships: the relationships that cultural institutions form within the sector, as well as outside of the sector. So it's this idea of bonding and bridging relationships. Or organizational social capital, and all of the factors, economic, political, and other factors will play out into this relationship. And in fact, I am expecting that organizations, when I will ask them about their partners or who they work with or who they depend on, they will name all these other actors. And so I'll be able to map it and see how all of these external factors play out. And like Jeff was suggesting, I would be able to hopefully look at organizations with different levels of sustainability and see how the difference between the networks and the effect of the networks on sustainability, depending on the level of organizational sustainability.
Sorry, in fact, may I just follow up on that? Methodologically speaking, since we're talking about grounded theory, it might sort of use a more constructivist version of grounded theory, which helps you sort of look at those paradoxes. So where your goal is really not so much to resolve paradoxes, but really to notice how the paradoxes are ongoing. Yeah. So Kathy Sharma's work, which is a more, dialectic-oriented way of thinking about grounded theory might be a little better than maybe Strauss and Portman.
Yeah. I use like a newer version of the grounded theory anyways, right? The less conservative version, but I'm looking forward to read Kathy's work and see how it applies to that. And the idea is that I would be able to pull out more examples and add them to this piece. But for the new project, I'm mainly going to use social networking analysis, which is thank you to Humanities Center for paying $1,500 for my training this summer. But that's kind of, I'm going to use this different methodology for the new study as well.
Thanks a lot for a really great talk, and it's interesting to hear a talk on sustainability that's so different from what I usually hear about sustainability. One thing, following up on what you said, I think it's really interesting to look at different cases where the outcomes haven't been so great, and also maybe not just the cases of museums that actually disappeared or vanished, but museums that may be surviving, but whose success is far from guaranteed or at least contested. So there can be, for example, a museum might be doing really well by the strategic planning framework, but maybe people just think now it's just not a museum anymore, it's become something else, and so it'd be interesting to look at it from that point of view. One, I don't know if this is a problem as much as just a concern, but I guess it's just a genuine question. Whenever you work on sustainability, you find yourself in this position of, everybody uses the word, and it's dissipated in lots of different disciplines for lots of different people, and it's really unstable. Even if you want to try to use the original, like, early 80s, or even go back to the limits to growth kinds of definitions of sustainability, they're vague enough to where they can be adapted to almost anything. And sometimes sustainability is employed in a way that actually implies almost a kind of social Darwinist language that actually goes on the more, I think, on the side you're trying to get away from, I was particularly looking even at terms some of the museum managers use, and people, well, this is the language of resilience, survival. It's harsh stuff, and maybe it says a lot about where museums are and where the not-for-profits are right now. They're like desert organisms barely clinging on. But is there a way to try to pin sustainability down a little bit because you have a specific kind of sustainability that you're thinking about? And is there a way to talk about it that tries to sort of plant the flag in the ground and make it more of that tries to pin it down a bit and makes it more linked to some tangible goals that clearly set other things in opposition, I guess?
Yeah,
That's not
I mean,
too
that
framing.
definitely has been an effort in a lot of the literature to kind of tangibilize sustainability, right? But I mean, part of me, I don't know, left or right part, is an ethics scholar, right? So I understand that when we talk about ethics, we cannot tangibilize everything.
Right.
So essentially what I am finding that we have a tangible piece of sustainability, but we also have an intangible piece of sustainability. However, without that intangible piece of sustainability, the tangible doesn't make sense.
Right.
Who cares if there is a museum who serves nobody? Right? Maybe that one person who supports the museum cares, but nobody else. So it's important to include both tangible and intangible levels. And in terms of sustainability language across different disciplines, I'm taking the organizational level, right? So I'm not taking societal level because I'm trained in studying organizations. That's why I'm saying, well, this is my niche. This is something that I am good at, and I'm going to explore sustainability within organizations. But it's also like when I look, for instance, at environmental sustainability discourse, and I'm sure we can probably ask Jeff about that, but the resilience language is huge. Everybody's talking about resilience. And yes, I find this to be one of the explanations of museum survival and sustainability as well. But resilience is only a piece of it. There is also a huge piece of distinctiveness and sustainable thinking that goes into play. So I cannot just reduce it to the level of resilience. And I have actually also done some work, and I'm currently working on the paper that I will present in this conference that Humanities Center is organizing, RES City. So the idea is that I will present a model of organizational sustainability of public and non-profit institutions. And this model will have several variables. So what I'm trying to do exactly what you're saying. I'm trying to tangibilize. I'm trying to say, well, there is finances, there is relationships, and that's how we can quantify relationships. There is other pieces. So I have kind of started working in this direction, but it's difficult because I am absolutely incapable to tangibilize everything.
Thank you. I think Jeff and Andrew have articulated what I was trying to formulate in my brain faster than I could. I was reading this as a paper on perceptions of sustainability by managers or found documents. And I think you're nodding your head. I do agree. And I think that works. And then the sampling frame appears to be different kinds of organizational forms. And so I think that communicates very well. I think what was strongest for me is bringing in the ethics in a way. I think there's too many concepts and theories in this paper. Maybe that journal likes that. I don't know that journal well enough. But I can just hear reviewer comment like what journals should be in that journal, and it doesn't have enough of this literature, I don't know. Like you can sort that out, but there's just too many concepts.
Yeah.
I did have the advantage I'm familiar with at least half of them. And yeah, like Jeff said, what you are not doing a study on sustainability as an outcome right now, and I don't even think you're doing one for Read the City or the proposal I saw. You're still at this very early stage of operationalizing and tangibilizing sustainability. And as long as you hammer that rhetorically, you can kind of get that out of readers' heads and I think that'll just clear the air for what
Makes
it really
sense.
is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you get to this, it starts to crystallize.
And that was in fact my strategy of how to sell this paper, right? Because
Yeah.
I cannot sell this paper by saying, because I have worked on this research for 2 years, now I have completely discovered the sustainability. So it was like, okay, this is the framework, and this is what I'm finding. And these are the pieces of the framework that haven't been voiced in previous literature, but now we have to go and explore the specific questions. So that's my kind of selling point as well, and that's something that the reviewers actually liked. They liked this as a setup, as a conceptual piece based on empirical work that could lead to further studies. In terms of the multitude of concepts, that was exactly one of the comments from one of the reviewers. So it's exactly is right?
Yeah.
But I can also tell you that this presentation had many more concepts that are actually in the paper,
I'm
because
sure.
I had to, because obviously you don't have a chance to read the paper, right? So I had to present it for audience that is not necessarily familiar with my work. So I put in more into this presentation that is actually in the paper. But kind of reducing the concepts or focusing on key concepts is something that I'm working on in the process of this revision.
I just thank you so much. That was so interesting. Very impressive. I have to ask, I would think that one of the factors perhaps that you look at is personnel in strategic sustainability, because I would think that that would be very important in, the success of a project.
And are you talking about like the leadership and the quality of leadership, or are you talking about the personnel capacity, like whether the museum has full-time staff, volunteers, like what level of the personnel?
Leadership. Because
Yeah.
they'd be the ones that, I would think, they'd be the ones setting the direction and hopefully making.
This hasn't been included in this paper, but I do have certain roles that museum managers play that are associated with sustainability. And some of those roles actually go directly into the definition of leadership, the way it's kind of accepted. So for instance, this idea of innovation or facilitation, or the idea of museum managers serving as a choreographer of social relationships. So I mean, I couldn't put this in this paper, but I had that because I looked at how managers describe their roles and what language they were putting in their roles, and which of these roles are leading to intergenerational or long-term sustainability. But essentially, yes, I do find that leadership matters, and I also find the nuance that leadership matters not only within the institution, but leadership also matters in terms of external relationships. So in my class, that's good that I have some students, so here too they will hear that, but essentially leadership has two dimensions. Leadership has an internal dimension, leadership within the organization, and external. So it's the ability of museums to connect with other institutions and build productive collaborative relationships. And this is the language that comes from one of my interviewees, is museum as a choreographer of social relationships. So this is the expression of external leadership that I found.
So this sounds like a tremendously difficult area to do research in. First of all, you can't, to compare two institutions that might have comparable roles and ask one of them, let's say, not to use social media and the other one to use it and see which one is sustainable. You're not going to be able to do that experiment. So number one, it's hard to find the failure one except by history. And number two, even if you could do that, since you're talking about intergenerational sustainability that lasts at least 35 years, number one, you're going to have to get tenure in order to complete the study. And the experiment's not over for at least 35 years. Now, I just wanted to say, I'm from one of those institutions in Detroit that might have been considered one of those that wasn't sustained, which is the Belle Isle Aquarium. So if Alisa had come here in 2005, she would have said, that's great, I'll study that one as a failure, and let's say the Art Institute as a success, or the zoo, which they were associated with. But I'm sorry, your study would have been over 7 years later because the aquarium is back.
But could I ask you something? Could aquarium learn something from the strategies? Is aquarium very good in all of these dimensions?
Well, I came today because I wanted to find out what to do to increase sustainability. We do have to do more social media, and we're right now creating more outreach programs. So
And
any
actually,
volunteers,
yeah.
and we want community involvement. So any volunteers here, if you want to work at the Belle Isle Aquarium on Saturdays or Sundays, cleaning the bathrooms and feeding the fish. That's important for sustainability. It's all volunteer run except for 2 part-time people now. Anyway, thank you very much, and I hope to continue to learn from you about how to sustain institutions
And
in
I'll be
Detroit.
happy to talk with you about that. And Jeff is actually one of the other core members of our sustainability group that we are putting together. So he's our science person for now. But in terms of aquarium, I think for aquarium, and you have told this to me when I was visiting aquarium, that you are planning to open part of your internal workings to the public for the observation.
Oh, as a matter of
the
fact,
lab,
that's-
right?
yeah.
So, and I think that's a great idea. That's something that hasn't existed in aquarium 7 years ago, right? But that's something that you're doing now. And that's something that I think will really help to draw people in.
I used to work at the DIA, and I'm an art student, so we spoke about this, and I know these institutions are depending a lot on social media because they see other entities use social media as like a method to bring out people. The problem is, it's like what somebody was saying about leadership. And I think also too, some leaders in these organizations are relying too much upon their name. Like, oh yeah, we're gonna just stick this on the Facebook underneath our name, and then people are just gonna come out. No, they're not. I mean, nobody really, not enough people are gonna care that you've been open for 150 years, 200 years. You have to treat, like with any other marketing campaign, you have to put a lot of time into it. And what I find with a lot of these organizations, being that I used to have to be a social media content editor, they don't put time into it. They just assume that people are just gonna, go to them or visit them. You have to create a conversation with people. It's more than just, oh, come out to our exhibition at 5 o'clock and pay us $10. No, you have to create a certain level of trust with people, unless it's just the institution that you just send your grandma to, So that's just been my experience, because I see people put forth these events, and it'd be like only 5 people liked it, 3 people showed up, and only 2 people shared it. But you're like the high muckety muck, Anytime someone's interviewing something in the city, they go to your institution, but it's not translating, between these 2 modalities. So
That makes sense. And there are 2 pieces of what we're talking about here. On one hand, it's technology and social media, and on the other hand, it's the idea of shared leadership. So in terms of technology and social media, it matters how museums think about it and other cultural institutions, because you can think about it, well, that's something that we can get money for, and why don't we apply for a grant and we get the money and we employ some people to digitize our collections. That's one way to think about it. But the other way to think about it is this intergenerational piece that I was mentioning, because you don't go to France and speak Spanish there, or Spanish probably is a bad example because it's a very widespread language. You don't go to France and you don't speak Japanese there, right? So you have to learn the language, or the commonly acceptable language. So when museum as an institution aspires to survive and to sustain across generations, they have to learn the language of young generations. I mean, there is no way around that. So technology is the language. Social media is the language. It is the kind of language that we need to talk to future generations. I mean, it even applies to our classrooms. Because more and more students would rather prefer to have Blackboard access on their phone, or text messaging or something like that we have to learn to. So to make anything relevant, not only culture and arts, you have to learn the language of these younger generations. Otherwise, you will be existing in 2 separate worlds, one in Japan and one in France. So that's the kind of thinking that I'm finding here. And in terms of the second idea, it's not included in this paper because it wasn't a paper on leadership necessarily, but it's a good idea to write a paper on the leadership and different forms of leadership that manifests themselves in sustainable organizations. So yeah, you gave me a great idea, thank you, both of you. But essentially what you're talking about is this idea of shared leadership. Because in conventional public management scholarship, we think about leadership as a prominent person who leads everyone and everyone is just following. That's kind of an outdated model of leadership. In the world of merged boundaries across sectors and collaborative public administration, we aspire to the idea of shared leadership. And the idea is that people who come in the door, they're not just visitors, they're participants of whatever museum is doing. Whether they're volunteers or whether they're supporters, whether they're engaging in a conversation. And that's the kind of leadership that museums should be exercising to be sustainable. But I didn't include it here because there is a vast literature in public administration on the importance of shared leadership, as opposed to a leader who leads the organization and then the organization dies. That's not a sustainable kind of leadership.
are there a common core of principles for sustainability of museums? Some, little, like Greens have their 7 points, sort of, if you look at green discourse, it's all over the map. But, that's sort of 6 or 7 key points. I agree with these, it makes you agree. Is there something like that for museums? We want sustainability, we need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Well, and in part what you're trying to put this into categories, right? So the way we think in political science. So I try to do this as well. So when I talk about, for instance, the relevance, doesn't want to go back, but when I talk about relevance, it's stuck. But essentially, I name specific strategies that increase the social and community relevance. So there is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So when we talk about the resilience narrative that's more explicit, we can boil it down to the strategies. This is what you have to do to sustain. But when we talk about distinctiveness or the reconciliation between these two narratives, we cannot really put it in the same categories. All we know that there should be certain kind of sustainable thinking. It's a commitment to certain values. It's a commitment to mission, and it's a commitment to future generations. And I cannot really put it into 1, 2, 3, but that's what I find, that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 should be supplemented by an ethical narrative or ethical imperative that helps museums to take this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and to really put it at work to help museums to transition from survival to sustainability. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I guess I have a combination of...
Well, I guess you have a rich set of data on how people talk about these things. Is there any way of sort of classifying them or categorizing them?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is classified and categorized, right? So if we look at the narrative, social and community relevance, right, narrative, then we know that using technology and social media is one piece. Then we know that engaging in cross-disciplinary projects is another piece. We know that engaging in public-private partnerships is another piece. So there are pieces that I was able to identify specifically within the resilience narrative. But in terms of the distinctiveness narrative, it's harder to use the same language to describe it. So commitment to mission, right? What exactly it means. I mean, we can talk here 3 hours and we would have different opinions. Or commitment to future generations. And so there are traces that are less quantifiable here as well.
I wonder, this isn't exactly the project you're working on here, but whether you're thinking about sort of a reverse type of project. The society around the museum or nature center, whatever, is important for the sustainability and survival of that institution. But what about the importance of that society being dependent upon the existence of those institutions? How important is it that, let's say, Detroit has an art institute? Obviously, it became very important in these recent negotiations. Many people felt it's not Detroit if we don't have an art institute or a symphony or aquarium. But at least those other two, for sure. And are there examples that you can point to in history where the failure of an institution like this led to the failure of the society as a whole, or had contributed to that?
Well, it's difficult, right, to define failure, right? So if an institution ceases to exist, does it mean that the society has failed? Probably not, but it means that the society has reduced. So, for instance, the Library of Alexandria, I mean, it was a major collection, and
Right.
we lost a lot of these works when it was burned, right? So we could in some ways consider this as failure, but that's what happens with culture and arts, because it penetrates into other social discourses. Although we lost the library, we didn't lose all of it, right? Because it got ingrained in works that were hosted in the Alexandria Library, they got ingrained into other works, they influenced scholars. So there is a continuity. So it's difficult to dissect that type of level of failure. But we can definitely, I mean, like you say, if we're thinking from experimental point of view, well, let's just close DIA for 5 years and see what happens. And I assure you, we will see the evidence of failure. Would it be a wholesale, complete failure? No, but it would be the reduction of the capacity of the society to be functional and productive and happy and sustainable, right?
Well, if Greenfield Village closed and the Art Institute closed, and let's say the the riverfront closed, you can't close that. What would happen to tourism? What would happen to the economic life of the city? There could be some direct
Yeah, there
impacts.
could be.
And
Mhm.
of course, institutions like that try to claim how important they are, but what is the evidence?
But there is definitely a relationship. It's the relationship between all of this, among all of these dimensions of sustainability, right? That one, like if one suffers, then the other ones are going to suffer too. But this is a good question to explore, and in fact, it's in some ways I was planning already to explore a piece of it if I get external funding, because and I haven't presented my current project, but the idea essentially is to interview 20-25 arts organizations and look at the relationship, look at the network. So I will be able to kind of get a one-side relationship. But if I can get funding to support this project, then in addition to interviewing these organizations, I could also interview other actors that are linked to these arts organizations and explore exactly what you were suggesting. How does art organization matter for them and for their own sustainability, survival, you name it. So it's possible to explore it, and it's possible to explore it through this networking methodology by mapping the members of the network and then studying their relationships. So that's definitely, and maybe I can use aquarium as a case study because I will be one organization, so it will be a little bit more manageable to explore these relationships. Well, thank you very much. Should we wrap up?